Today is Wednesday, February 8, 2012. My name is Mark Depew, the Director of Oral History of the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library. And today I'm in Elmhurst, Illinois for my third session with former Speaker Lee Daniels. Good afternoon.
How are you today?
Good.
Nice, bright and sunny day.
It's a nice day for February.
That's right.
It's a good day to talk about Illinois politics.
Absolutely. It's always a good day to talk about Illinois politics.
Well, it's always an interesting subject, isn't it?
It is.
Wanted to start. Last time we finished off with your appointment as the minority leader in the House, the Republican minority leader. And this is one of the first elections, maybe the first after, let's see, a couple of different events. The Cutback Amendment and then the reapportionment that would happen at the beginning of the 1980s.
Right.
And I read someplace, and this you let me know if this sounds familiar, that before the Cutback Amendment, the Republicans had a majority in the House?
That's correct.
91 to 86. So it was fairly close, but a majority. And afterwards, after the Cutback Amendment and this reapportionment, you were minority leader as Republican leader and 48 to 70 Democrats.
We had a very, very troubling election in that year and lost a number of seats and consequently lost just an incredible number of members. And I remember it well because I was truly elected the leader of the minority. And it was kind of a shock to a lot of the older members who had served in the majority in several instances. And we came about that election with some hope, but because of redistricting, because of the Cutback Amendment, it was more prevalent than before how strong Chicago would always be in the elections in the House, particularly in Illinois, because generally speaking, they have about 36 districts in Chicago alone out of 118. So they start with, and almost all of those have historically always been Democrat. So you start with 36 to nothing is the score when you open your game, if I could call it that. And then you have to build your support for the Republicans downstate or in the collar counties. So when the election results came in and we found out how much we had lost and recovered from the shock of the moment, I had the good fortune, of course, of being elected by my caucus as the minority leader. The bad fortune of losing the speakership election, of course, to my opponent at that time, Speaker Mike Madigan. Unique problems were presented then. How do we address this issue of new membership, fewer members? The Democrats were excited to take over control of the House again. George Ryan had been elected lieutenant governor. Mike Madigan was elevated to Speaker and started his long career at that point as Speaker of the House. And I was faced with firing close to 20 secretaries because we no longer had members to match up with them. So one of the first things I had to do is sit down and go through every secretarial appointment and every secretary and the qualifications. I selected as my administrative assistant Denise Pierce. She now is Denise Pierce Reed, who over the years became one of my strongest and most reliable assistants because she literally ran the details of the House Republican organization. That is hiring and firing secretaries, keeping track of records and things like that. Well, Denise and I had to sit down and start putting together this recommendation. And then, of course, I had to select my new leadership team and then go through with them and make recommendations on how to proceed. It was a pretty tough role, combined with the fact now I had to put together the agenda for the Republicans in the House for the first time. So challenging times.
Which would you credit as the bigger reason for the big difference, the big drop in the Republican membership? Was it the Cutback Amendment? Was it the reapportionment?
Well, I don't think there's any question that both contributed to it, but the Cutback Amendment was a dramatic change because we no longer had a member of the Republican Party in Chicago. We ended up with, I think, one Chicago Republican legislator. The rest were Democrats. I think that's an unfortunate scenario because now you don't, in the Republican caucus, you don't have Republican legislators sitting there arguing for Chicago benefits, and so it pits parts of the state against each other.
I want to ask you a couple inside baseball kind of questions. And you just mentioned the word caucus. The Illinois legislature historically, at least in my memory, has been organized around the 4 caucuses.
Correct.
What does it mean then to be the leader of one of those 4 caucuses? How does that flesh out staff-wise, for example?
Well, the leader of the caucus, and in my case, in the Republican House, I would be in charge of hiring all secretarial and staff members that support the caucus or support the Republican members. That includes secretarial assistant, that includes research assistants, that includes press people, that includes anybody that would work for the House Republicans would be under my auspices to hire. And that includes staffing for various legislators and assigning them to that staff to the various legislators. So if you're a member of the Republican caucus, I would furnish your secretarial assistant. Now, you could come in and ask me to hire somebody, and if they're qualified, I would be receptive to that.
Each one gets one?
Towards the end, that's exactly what happened. But, many times at the beginning, we shared secretaries. 2 legislators, 1 secretary.
How about for the legislators who were not in Springfield, who lived in Chicago or the suburbs area? Were they allowed to have somebody in their
Well, they would have
district?
their in-district office, but they had to utilize their in-district allotment. Each legislator has an amount of money to run his or her district office. I'm not sure what it is today, but it's like $60,000 today. And in today's dollars, that converts to the dollars that were back in 1981.
Okay. So not that much.
No, it's not that much when you talk about paying rent, electricity, common areas, supplies, typewriters, well, not computers, excuse me, I'm aging myself, computers, and your total assistant.
And then you want to have that assistant be somebody who is responsive to the constituents?
Oh, absolutely. That person is your front line of assistants. That's the one that answers the phone, that makes sure that questions are answered, makes sure that the casework is handled. Towards the end of my career, we were handling 3,000 pieces of casework a year, just out of my office.
As the caucus leader, as one of the 4 caucus leaders in the legislature, how much of a staff did you personally control?
Well, I mean, one could argue that I controlled all of the staff, which ranged to 120 and maybe to 150 at the highest point. My personal staff, because my legislative office was not just for my district, it was the Northern Illinois Legislative Office, which served in the collar counties all of the legislators and helped them with their district office as well as my own. And then we had a Chicago office in the State of Illinois building, and then we had the Springfield office.
Can you run through some of the specific positions would have been in your staff that were under your direct control?
On the staff level, you had the chief of staff, obviously, and I had a deputy chief of staff. Once I had 2 deputy chiefs of staff, but deputy chief of staff. Research director, that would be the person that handled all of the policy aspect and the research, not the policy, but the research aspects. Policy director, that's the person that helped me establish our future vision policy, such as the educational policy, such as the RTA reform that we sponsored, and several other pieces.
Were most of those people that you started with people you inherited from Ryan?
Most of them would have been, yes. Yes, my chief of staff at that time was Zale Glauberman, a highly regarded individual.
Eric?
Zale Glauberman. Zale, highly regarded person, very steeped in knowledge in the legislative process, and worked for George Ryan.
Where did most of those people come from? Are they just kind of
Well,
gravitate to the legislature
yeah.
looking for those kind of positions?
I mean, obviously Springfield is a big supplier of assistants such as secretaries and various positions, but for the most part it's college graduates or people that want to serve in state government. I mean, we had incredible numbers of hires of college graduates. Laura Anderson, who became my chief of staff towards the end of my career, started in my office right out of Western Illinois University and started working for my office, and grew from a policy analyst, which is one of the entry-level positions, to the chief of staff.
Is there an internship program that people
There
can
is.
start
We
with?
do have. For instance, many times we had college professors here in Elmhurst. Andrew Prince was a professor at Elmhurst College, would call me up and say, I have an outstanding student that I think you ought to look at for an intern position. One of those students ended up to be the clerk of the House, by the name of Terry McClellan, who was the clerk of the House when I was Speaker. So I had tremendous resources, whether it be from Northwestern or Elmhurst College or University of Illinois. We had internships and graduates that would come to our office.
Are there specific rules that are written by the legislature that apply to the 4 caucus leaders and their staffs then?
Well, there are rules. I mean, you know, you're not allowed to do political work on state time, which we watch very carefully, as you know. And you're not allowed to, well, I mean, those are the basic rules, you know, and things flow from there. But having said that, you know, it's mainly a job that people entry level that are interested in state government and want to move forward in state government. And we became an entry level position. In other words, if somebody wanted to work for state government, many times they went to the House. And then from then, the governor, depending upon who he was, would hire from there. And my staff was always one that they hired a lot of people from, a lot of turnover, because then the governor would see how John Jones, that's just a fictitious name, was progressing, and then he'd go and offer him a higher job, higher pay, and more opportunity.
More than the senatorial side, you think?
Oh, but without a doubt. First of all, our staff was larger to begin with, but we were a major entry-level office.
Okay, next couple questions then deal with some of the things that wouldn't necessarily be specific legislative or protocol kinds of things, but were part of what these caucus leaders were expected to do. And as the leader of the party is selecting candidates to run in future elections and to raise funds. Can you tell us a little bit about how that worked?
All of the above. You're really, in a sense, a jack of all trades. You're expected to, of course, sustain your caucus. You're expected to be the leader of the caucus and protect the members, which we had incumbency protection programs. What do I mean by that? I mean how to set up a district office, how to run a district office, you know, some of the hires you're looking for, how to structure your forms, you know, how to respond to somebody that is interested in casework. So we had seminars in casework. You're also expected to support that district member during election time, so you become an advisor in that sense, and raise a ton of money, as much as you can raise.
And that's oftentimes what Mike Madigan is credited of doing so well, and then he can dole it out to those members who need some help, and they're beholden to him because they do that. Is that a fair assessment of how it works?
It's a fair assessment. You know, the membership they want to support their leader. That's a natural thing. And they want their leader to excel, because when the leader excels, so do they. Now, with the cutback amendment, the 4 leaders became more powerful in their positions. Prior to that, you had single multi-member districts. You had some Republican legislators in Democrat districts, some Democrat legislators in Republican districts, like right here in Elmhurst. Bill Redmond, who became Speaker of the Illinois House, as you know, and we talked about earlier, was a Democrat from DuPage County, lived in Bensonville. He and I were on the same ticket. Gene Hoffman, Republican, me, Republican, and Bill Redmond, Democrat. Bill Redmond became the Speaker of the House for 6 years. And that was as a result of the minority representation that was allowed under cumulative voting. The cutback amendment destroyed that. And what happened is the leaders became very, very influential and very powerful within the caucuses, because you were expected to do more for your membership. And we did. The position of leader is an incredibly difficult one. You set the policy, you set the vision, you set the drive and the compassion, and you set the standards at election time. You have a major voice in the party because you have a major number of people in your caucus that are spread throughout the state of Illinois, which then become party members to structure in my case, the Republican Party of Illinois.
You've already expressed your views about the cutback amendment, that wasn't a good thing in terms of how it worked out.
And history tells us that.
And you just talked about how that caused the four leaders to be even more powerful.
That's correct.
And yet you are one of those leaders.
That's correct. I worked within the system.
I understand that. How would you want to reform the system several years removed from
Well, I think the cumulative voting was an excellent way. We had when you did historical studies of the electioneering and voting for legislators in Illinois during cumulative voting, the percentage of members elected was reflective of the percentage of party membership within the individual district. A Democrat district generally elected 2 Democrats and 1 Republican. But each district throughout the state of Illinois had a minority representative in that district, which then would go to their respective caucus and argue on behalf of their district. This was a good thing. Chicago had many Republican legislators down in Springfield that would argue for the benefit of the city of Chicago. This is a good thing. Today, the tendency is Chicago versus the rest of the state. And it's not that that's particularly something new, it's just that you don't have Republican legislators representing the city.
Here's another critique that you oftentimes hear about the way Illinois politics works in the legislative level. And it goes back to the issue of how powerful those 4 leaders are, the 4 tops. I'm sure you've heard that about a million times.
That and a number of other descriptive adjectives.
That when it gets down to crunch time and negotiating with budgets or negotiating with other important pieces of legislation, it always ends up being maybe 5 people who get together. The 4 caucus leaders and the governor. Is that also a factor of the cutback amendment, that it's been more that way?
Well, I would say probably so. The summit meetings started under Thompson, and that was when they called the 4 leaders in and we started the summit meeting. And my recollection serves me properly, it was over the RTA reform in the early 80s. However, it's not completely accurate in the sense that when we had these meetings that people refer to, there's no question the 4 leaders and the governor were in those meetings, but so were the governor's budget staff, so was each individual leader's budget experts, and many times your legislative budget chairman would be part of those meetings, or that would be a subcommittee of those meetings. So it's not as if the 4 leaders walked in and sat down with the governor and said, well, here's the budget. Can we agree on this? You may have done that in the final analysis. In other words, when you had to move X number of dollars to balance the budget, it would be left to the 4 leaders and the governor would go back to their staffs and their members to get approval. But everything ends up being responsible to your members. And if you aren't responsible to your members, you're not going to survive.
Okay, a little bit more of this inside baseball stuff.
Why not?
Well, that's the kind of stuff I'm always fascinated by.
I know you are. I can tell by the look on your face.
Can you tell us what the legislative cycle was at the time you took the minority leadership position? The legislative year, how it worked?
Well, at the time we generally started session in January. We worked up maybe a few days each week in January, towards the end of January. Then increased to 3 days in February. Then many times went to 3-4 days in March. Then 4 days and more in certain cases in April. May, towards the end of May, became more full-time, and June was full-time until hypothetical adjournment on the 1st of July.
Hypothetical adjournment.
Right.
And what point in time did the supermajority come into play?
At that time, in the early 80s, it was on the midnight, the 1st of July, or the 30th of July.
And supermajority was what?
3/5.
3/5, 60%.
Yeah, right.
Okay. During those first few years, did you have to resort to to going beyond the first of July and supermajority?
We were experts at it. Because you got to remember, during the normal session, the majority vote rules, And today it's 60 votes. Then what was it, 89 votes at the start when I first started, but then in the cutback it became 60 votes. 60 votes rules. Some people would make jest and say you could suspend the Constitution with 60 votes. Not totally true, but hypothetically you could argue that. Majority rules was the standard, and during the course of the session we would lose every meaningful vote that the Speaker wanted to support. His members were going to support him, and we would lose on a straight vote. So the only way we could get into an extraordinary majority where they had to pay attention to us was to go beyond the deadline date, which would infuriate the Speaker, Mike Madigan, and Phil Rock in the early days, and Pate Phillip, because then the House Republicans really became a part of the process. And of course, generally speaking, in the world of hardcore politics, you don't want the minority ruling anything.
Mm-hmm. I'm looking at the spread here. At first it was 48 Republicans, 70 Democrats, so in essence they had a supermajority, even if they got to that point.
They only needed, that's right, they did. And it was tough.
How much of the work was done in committees versus on the whole body?
It's changed over the years, and I see signs of it changing back today, which I'm happy to say. But there was more work done in committees initially, and then towards the cutback amendment, and as we started solidifying the caucuses, the leaders and the leadership team would determine a lot of positions on legislation and pass that down to the committees. Less and less work was done in actual committees. Now, moving forward to today, we've seen signs that now the committees are being strengthened, and that's to Speaker Madigan's credit. And I think that the membership has started to speak up and say they want to be more involved in appropriations and other matters. I think that's healthy. I think that's good.
You mentioned earlier that Thompson was the one that really had this innovation of the summit meetings. Was that not going on as much before that time?
Not as much, no. You'd have individual meetings, and many times the governors would meet with them. But remember now, when I entered the legislature, Dan Walker was governor. The Democrats disliked him more than Republicans disliked him. And there was hardly any communication there. So you didn't have a lot of meetings with the various leaders until the very end.
Okay. And one final question in this line here. Mm-hmm. I wondered if you could, at the time of the early 80s, give us a snapshot view of the political demographics of the state.
In the early 80s. Well, I think it was more competitive than today. We certainly, I don't remember the exact name of all the constitutional officers, but it was more divided in terms of the state was more a switch state, you could say, Republican, Democrat. Today, of course, there's no getting away from it. We are a Democrat state in every sense of the word. Even the president comes from Illinois. And, of course, prior to this last election, all constitutional officers came from the Democrat Party and from the city of Chicago. Now, to Dan Rutherford's credit, he's one of the first downstaters in a while to be elected to statewide office. So it was... I would say, after the shock of the loss of several members in the cutback years, the Republicans started settling in and knowing we had a large road to climb and started on that climb.
Would it be fair to say then, demographically, that the city of Chicago was solidly Democrat?
Absolutely.
That the collar counties were heavily leaning towards
I would
Republican?
say solidly Republican.
And then the rest of the state?
Well, the rest of the state, a lot of it was Republican downstate. A lot of it was Republican.
And I know some of those southern Illinois areas were traditionally Democrat, were they not?
That's right, but if you take downstate Illinois, it leaned more Republican. Because remember, you had a huge delegation of all Democrats coming from Chicago. To have any kind of competition, the rest of the state had to lean more Republican.
Were the Democrats from the southern part of the state, let's say below I-80 or even below I-70, of a different flavor than Democrats in the city?
Many times they talked, acted, and wanted to vote like Republicans. Very much in favor of the Second Amendment, for instance. Many were pro-life. This is in the 80s, and very conservative. And you found that many of the Democrat members of the House down in southern Illinois were as conservative as many of your suburban Republicans.
Were you able to find ways to work with them, to have them break from the caucus?
You know, it was difficult because along with the more powerful position of the leaders also became more individualized control over the members as well. And that's by staffing, by campaign contributions, by assistance to the members at election time, and working with the party and things like that.
Okay. Well, a lot of the rest of the time here we're going to be talking about specific budget fights or pieces of legislation. And I don't know, you're only, 30-some, 40 years removed from some of these things. So your memory hopefully is much better than mine. But I think you might remember one of your first battles once you got into the minority leadership position, because it was, what is it, in 1983 that Thompson proposes an income tax increase of something like $1.6 billion, even though you kind of run against that theme?
Yeah, it was a big one. And from the get-go, the House Republicans opposed that and worked very, very hard to make sure our members were in opposition to it. Now, of course, I have an extremely high regard for Governor Thompson. I think he historically has been one of the best governors the state has had, to my knowledge. I think he met the times, but many times we would say to the Governor Thompson, you know, you live in Chicago, you come from Chicago, you grew up in Chicago, you were the U.S. Attorney for Northern Illinois, your allegiance has been to Chicago. Well, of course, he would take exception to that. And it's fair. I mean, you know, that's not totally accurate, but when the income tax increase came out, the Republican House members were very opposed to it.
Just from a philosophical, small government
combination of
standpoint?
that, and didn't feel we needed it. We shouldn't increase spending in the state.
Why was he proposing? That's a significant increase at the time, $1.6 billion.
Well, Jim Thompson was a spender. And I can also say Jim Thompson was a builder. And you can put whatever context you want on that. I mean, all governors want to have a solid budget to operate from. All governors want to have some say over the infrastructure and capital programs within the state. All governors want to make sure that at the end of the day they're able to hand out new programs, build new successes, and to point to that during the course of their career. One of the reasons, jumping forward, that Jim Edgar has been so highly regarded is he resisted much of that. Jim Edgar was able to say no. As a matter of fact, many times we'd call him Dr. No. And we'd start a conversation. I know what you're going to say before we answer this, but here's what I have. No. Governor, can you learn how to say yes? Not in this climate. So Jim Edgar was very disciplined, deserves a great deal of credit for the times that he led the state through it. Jim Thompson was a builder. Jim Thompson understood the nature of governance and how to address the people's needs. The income tax increase built into it.
This particular battle in 1983, as I understand, not taking away your comment about being a builder, but this is, I think, about 3 years before his big initiative called Build Illinois.
Right.
So what was causing his concern about raising more money? Was it things like Medicaid and welfare increases, or?
I think it was basically governmental cost increases and the services that people were asking for. You know, those were the beginning of cradle-to-grave concerns, which we're now more than ever paying for today with the expansion of Medicaid, which is, in today's terms, one of the most difficult issues to deal with in terms of government financing. And that was the start of that. And the governor wanted to increase taxes in order to cover these new costs and have some new programs.
1983 is part of the explanation. That's the United States at the national level is coming out of a pretty deep recession.
Historically, Illinois was late going into a recession, but also late coming out of a recession. And Illinois was experiencing much the same, and the last thing we wanted to do is increase spending to kind of set back some job growth and things of that nature.
was your proposal then something of a temporary tax increase?
Well, that came later on. Our proposal was no.
when the negotiations started.
And Governor Thompson is a very articulate and convincing person, and he would meet regularly with the four leaders, but I would say Senator Phillips signed on a lot quicker than Senator Phillips was very close to Governor Thompson, and they had and to this day have a very good relationship and high regard for each other. And his caucus was agreeable much before that. Now, with all due respect to Mike Madigan is for any kind of tax increase. Just tell him how you spend it, how you pay for it, rather. If you ask Mike, are you for a new Capitol bill today? He'd say, sure. How do I pay for it? In other words, Democrats generally spend money. Republicans generally are against spending and new programs. Again, a generalization. Senator Rock, who I have and had a very high regard for, was generally in favor of increased spending on government projects. So the House Republicans were kind of the sole force out there, and of course a lot of attention came down on me and the new leader in the House, and how can I not listen to what the governor says of my own party? Very simple. We thought he was wrong. And I think history tells us that at the end of the day, we crafted a program that really was quite effective.
How were you able to slow this process down if the governor wants to spend more money, and I'm assuming that he can get Madigan and most of the Democrats to go along with him, then they've got the majority they need in the House, don't they?
Yeah, but they were not willing to put their own votes on it. They wanted Republicans to be part of the process, and I understand that. And in other words,
the caucus the Democratic caucus would direct their peoples to vote against it, even though in their heart of hearts they wanted to have it pass.
Well, generally the caucus wouldn't go in and say, "Please call this bill. We can't wait to pass to vote on a new tax increase." Generally, the leader would articulate the position, and then from there build support for it. And Madigan's position, and of course the others, were that they wanted everybody to be part of the solution, which meant that you diffuse some of the voting patterns. So at the end of the day, I had, by the way, I might say, some wonderful, very, very competent legislative members that were very schooled, one of whom was Jim Riley, who, as you know today, serves as the head of the Convention Bureau in Chicago, and throughout times the head of McCormick Place, and others has served in top positions, including chief of staff over the years to the governor, and a very, very skilled person. And I put together a team that helped build our approach, because the governor said, well, if you're not for this, what are you for? And I said, well, give me a week or two and I'll come up with something that we can support.
So in a situation like this, would the expectation be that the governor, a Republican, wants to see a budget passed that's going to be a substantial increase in taxes, and that he expected both you and Pate Phillip to present that same position or your position in the legislature?
That's fair to say.
Okay, so Madigan could sit back and wait for you guys to...
That's also fair to say. Generally speaking, again, this is one of these generalities that history has proven true over the years, but then you can pick a specific example of a different opinion. But generally speaking, the Democrats that run the House or Senate would prefer to have a Republican governor.
Because?
They could spread the blame. They know you have to govern. When you're governor, it's much different than being the Speaker of the House or the President of the Senate. You have to govern and actually run the state and not let the state fall behind. One of the problems we've had in the past few years is the people in that position don't know how to govern. And one of them, unfortunately, is in jail or on his way to jail. One's in jail, one's on his way to jail, and another one doesn't understand the true art of governance and doesn't have a very high regard by his own membership. We've suffered as a result of that. Jim Thompson, Jim Edgar, George Ryan, all understood the art of governance. And Rod Blagojevich we know about, and of course, we know the trouble we have today with our current governor.
Yeah, I want to say that in my interviews with Governor Edgar, he was very clear in saying exactly that thing, that it was better usually to have a divided government.
I felt that way, and of course I was elected speaker under a complete Republican control. We controlled every office. It was an interesting dynamic because it made it even more difficult, I think, to govern. You would think, oh, well, you're all Republicans. Well, that doesn't mean we all like little mushrooms that line up each other in the dark. We all had individual commitments, and we all had different members. Remember, I had generally twice the membership that the Senate had. So my membership was much more diverse, much more difficult to govern, and much more difficult at times to work with. I had to run up to 21 to 25 campaigns every election cycle. The Senate leaders maybe had 3. I had to raise money to compete with Mike Madigan. The Senate leaders generally only had to raise enough money to cover 3 or 4 races.
You're saying the number of races, in other words, the number of races where it was close enough to matter?
Contested races that we targeted or focused on.
Okay. Was your caucus generally more conservative than either Governor Thompson or Edgar?
I would say more conservative than Thompson, and for the most part, about maybe a little more conservative than Jim Edgar.
How about then the Senate Republicans?
Well, as it relates to Thompson, they walked almost lockstep with him. I mean, you know, I used to joke about Pate, who is a good friend of mine, and my running mate, by the way, my senator. And I used to say, Pate, can you ever say no to Governor Thompson? I said, what's with you two guys? I said, you come out and you say terrible things, and then the next thing I know, you're sponsoring the bill that he wants. Gross receipts tax on oil. When Thompson proposed that, Pate said, not in your life. Terrible, most ridiculous bill ever, and he ends up sponsoring it. Tax increase on liquor. Pate ends up the sponsor.
When those are some
now
of them...
You may get a disagreement from somebody else, but I'm telling you that's the truth.
Well, I'll have hopefully an opportunity to interview Senator Phillip here, too.
And you're going to say, Lee Daniels said.
Well, I might say that. Who knows?
Who knows?
I did want to quote you for this particular important battle that you had over the 1983 budget, and here was one of the quotes that you had. I developed a temporary tax program that worked because the purpose of the temporary tax concept was when you have one-time debt and you're in a recession and you're moving out, you can pay off the bills, improve cash flow, allow the government to recover, and then terminate the tax.
Exactly right. You avoid the cliff. And what we did was we knew we were coming out of a recession. We knew we needed money to balance our budget. By having a temporary tax, you infuse the revenues with enough money to come out of it, and then as the recession continues to recover, you drop off that tax. It's a sound economic principle. But many times people say they'll do it, and they don't. We said we'd do it, and we did it. We terminated that tax.
Well, sometimes you don't. You could certainly be referring to the 1989 tax increase, and
One could
certainly
say that.
we're going to face the same thing in, about a year from now with this...
Where do you think those ideas came from? The idea of the temporary tax came from our 1983 program, and they've been using that ever since. But, you know, people are a little cynical because they haven't always terminated it. And we could see an end. We actually calculated the end of the recession and how the state of Illinois would recover and why we could terminate it. Today, people are cynical because they can't figure out how we're going to ever manage without the money that the taxes brought in.
Is part of that because as soon as they get the income tax increase, they spend it on other things?
Absolutely. You couldn't put it better than you just put it. Look at what was proposed by the Governor's State of the State message just the other day, February 2012, where Governor Quinn wants to spend several billions of dollars more in Medicaid spending and aid to families. Now, is it something we'd like to do? Sure. Can we afford it? No. Why do you think we didn't pass universal health insurance years ago in the state? because when it first came out, Cardinal Bernardi's proposal, it would cost the state $56 billion to implement the program. Is it noble? Yes. Can we afford it? No.
Okay. Still on 1983 then.
Oh, you're going back to that. You're not going to accept me jumping to 2012, huh?
No, that's what we want. But I guess I'm the guy who has to impose some kind of a chronological order. At least that's my approach I like.
You're the master of ceremonies.
July 1st, 1983, gas tax passes. Was that a temporary or a permanent increase?
No, that was a permanent increase. That was an increase on the gas tax so we could have an effective road program.
I think the next day, income tax increase, and that's the temporary part of it.
Right. And that was an example of bipartisan working together. Once the program was developed, we actually wrote a white paper on it, a booklet on the temporary tax. And you may be able to find it in a library or so forth. But the temporary tax, we set out in the whole program, explained where we were, how we could then terminate it in the future years and move forward. When that was finally agreed to by the four leaders, Speaker Madigan and I agreed to a vote assistance. In other words, how many votes would I put up and how many would he put up?
Can you go into that a little bit more? Because this is not an anomaly in
this
Illinois.
Is now we have an agreement. The agreement is we will increase the income tax on a temporary basis. And then you talk about how we're going to pass this. You need 60 votes to pass it. So don't hold me to this number because I don't remember the exact percentage. But I have, say, 40% of the, or 36% of the membership. So I put up 36% of the vote. Madigan has the balance of the membership, so he puts up the balance of the vote. And that's how you'd work an agreed vote, agreed bill process.
And the people that both sides find to vote for a particular bill is necessarily safe. It's not necessarily how they personally feel about the bill, as to whether or not they're in a safe district.
Well, you always have to use convincing approaches to have a legislator vote for something. You can't just walk in there and say, Mark, vote for this. Because Mark's going to say, wait a second. I'm an elected member of the House. I represent 110,000 people. Why? Well, Mark, first of all, look how your district's going to benefit by this. You live here. Here's how much the school aid formula is going to go up. Here's how much we can do in road construction. Here's what we can do here and here and here and here. And it's a good thing. And besides that, you're safe. What do you mean by that? What I mean by that is you tend to your district. They know you. You can explain this vote, and people will understand it. Versus John Jones down the street, again a fictitious name. John Jones down the street is in a targeted district, and he's going to have a hell of an election. And we don't want him voting for any kind of tax increase. So do your caucus members a favor.
Were there some issues where it was much more difficult to convince people to...
Sure. Tort reform.
Tort reform.
Tort reform in 1995. Passed with all Republican votes. And it took every Republican to support it and pass it. Not one Democrat supported it. And there were some plaintiffs' lawyers in our caucus that didn't want to vote for tort reform. It took some very direct meetings and some strong support.
See, I would think that some of the tax increases could be just as toxic to the Republican members.
Well, it could be, but we didn't pass tax increases with all Republican votes. Unlike the Democrats in 2011, passed it with all Democrat votes. We never did that, nor would we do that, because you would never be able to generate all Republican votes for a tax increase.
Okay.
Now, I might be able to generate 30 votes, but not all.
The rest of the package from 1983 for the tax increases, I understand it, was an increase in liquor and gasoline. We talked about gas already, and highway user taxes.
And I think a penny sales tax increase.
Okay. All of those things would be permanent? Only
Yes.
the income tax was
Yes.
temporary?
Yes.
Okay. Well, that's quite a way to start your term as leader of the minority party.
Let's just say it was a major experience, and it set the stage for learning right off the bat and being able to govern in a sense that protected my membership, because the temporary income tax increase did protect my membership.
Okay. We were talking about the legislative cycle. I don't know that we talked very much about the veto session. How did the veto session work?
Well, anything in a veto session to become effective immediately requires an extraordinary majority to be effective immediately. And the veto session generally is for issues that were unresolved in the regular session, in the sense that the governor has mandatorily vetoed them or vetoed the bill that went to him. And then the membership can determine whether or not to override the veto or accept or reject the mandatory veto. That's generally what the veto session is about. There are times when they'll pick up important issues to deal with that came up during the summer and in the early fall.
You alluded to a couple things that are different from the U.S. Constitution, the mandatory veto, and maybe not mentioned specifically, but a line item veto as well. Does the governor have both of those?
Yes, and most governors have an mandatory veto and line item veto power, as does Illinois. And what they mean by that is he can take a budgetary appropriation bill and line item veto out portions of that. And a mandatory veto in a substantive bill, he can change some of the language within the bill. An example of that, if you are a lover of the chief at the University of Illinois, when I was speaker, we passed a law as a response to the opposition to the chief that basically said the chief shall be the symbol, distinguished from mascot, shall be the symbol of the University of Illinois. And it passed the House, passed the Senate, went to the governor. Governor Edgar, in one of his rare inappropriate actions, mandatorily vetoed the bill and inserted the word may be the symbol of the University of Illinois. And by doing that, did not resolve the controversy. And the House and Senate ultimately accepted his wording just to get it done. And the trustees then were pressured to say, the law allows you to terminate the chief, therefore you should. If Governor Edgar had signed the bill as sent to him, we'd still have the chief as the symbol of the University of Illinois. Not the mascot, but the symbol.
It's interesting because one of his aides was the former mascot at University of Illinois.
Mr. Livingston.
Tom Livingston.
Mm-hmm.
Now I've forgotten what question I wanted to ask in that respect. Okay, so back to, the line item veto versus the mandatory veto.
Mm-hmm.
I have heard criticisms about Governor Thompson's abuse of the mandatory veto, that the
You mean that he would just rewrite the bill so it's entirely different than it was?
The Constitutional Convention put it in with the mind that, okay, we're just going to tweak when there's a language problem and not actually make substantive changes to the bill.
I can't think of a specific instance, but I do remember that criticism. And I can say that Speaker Madigan has taken the position that he, as the presiding officer of the House, and also obviously the Senate presiding officer would have the same authority, can determine whether or not the mandatory veto is within the confines of the constitutional authority granted to him. And at times has ruled it to be out of sync with the Constitution.
Well, I'm jumping ahead myself now, but this is an example where he and Governor Blagojevich were bumping heads constantly.
That's one example of many.
Okay, back to the 83 veto session. I think it was in that session that the legislature dealt with the Regional Transit Authority.
The RTA.
The RTA.
I believe that's correct, but on that subject matter, that was the start of what was called the summit meetings, that Governor Thompson requested the 4 leaders to join him in the mansion and to discuss a resolution of the RTA and to create a summit-style meeting. And it was a formal process. In fact, they actually, I think Joan Parker actually wrote a book on the summit meeting at that time. And
can you lay out the various sides in that, what the issues were all about?
Well, the issue was about making sure that the suburbs had adequate representation in the operation of the Regional Transportation Authority. And of course, Chicago wanted to take total control over it. And the suburbs have a huge stake in it because most of the people that ride it come from the suburbs.
Did it even exist before that time?
Not in that format, no.
So there was a Chicago Transit Authority that
Right.
extended out to the suburbs to a certain extent?
To Oak Park,
Okay.
not as far as it does today, obviously. And there was a bus system, and there was a rail system, and of course then you had the CTA. Obviously, the Northwestern Railroad has been running for years, and obviously the bus system had been running. So what happened was Thompson wanted to resolve all these issues and figure out a way to do that. Once again, I was able to call on some very skilled people in my caucus to help draft this legislation, and we came up with the RTA concept. That is with the Metro system for rail, the PACE system for bus, and the CTA system. And the CTA obviously basically has the mayor appointing, and I don't know how many appointments from the governor, but some. Metro has appointment by Cook County Commissioners, and PACE is by Cook County Commissioners and Collier County, so you divided it up. At the end of the day, Chicago had a huge stake in it, as did the suburbs. Excuse me. So what we found in crafting this agreement, RTA reform we called it, another white paper which again is somewhere floating around. It's a booklet about that thick. RTA reform. What we found was that by doing this we could then bring in the various caucuses to support the reform legislation, and this was a result of the summit meeting that took place.
Wasn't this something that both Democrats in the city of Chicago and Republicans in the Collier County would naturally support?
The end result, but not at the beginning, because the question becomes, who makes the appointments? The governor would have some appointments, and what happens if the governor is a Democrat? Will we have all Democrats? No. We wanted to make sure that you had Republican and Democrat support for the makeup and structure of the organization.
Was that a matter of doling out the patronage or the power, or both?
More about how it's operated and who has the influence in the operation of it. It's not a party matter per se, but it is making sure that there's suburban representation.
Okay. That's a lot for one legislative year, isn't it?
Yeah, I was pretty tired. No, actually, fortunately, I was young enough to be able to handle it. It was an experience, but I was up to it.
1984, was that as busy a legislative year for you?
I don't recall it being as busy as that, as productive as that, but obviously issues came up.
Going through the box of pens that you had of signing all the various pieces of legislation, the one that I did find for 1984 was the Water Commission for DuPage County. I don't know if that rings a bell for you or not.
It sure does. It became apparent that particularly DuPage County, because of its growth and because of its size, the largest suburban county, was down the road going to dry up. Its wells were going to dry up. We were going to have a serious water shortage. Well, a mere 15 miles away is the wonderful Great Lakes called Lake Michigan, fresh water. 3 mayors from Elmhurst, Villa Park, and Lombard had created the Treetown Water Commission. The sole purpose of that was to bring Lake Michigan water into DuPage County and to service Elmhurst, Villa Park, and Lombard. But they also had visions of the 3 municipalities controlling the water for all of DuPage County. It's like the old range wars. Who controls the water controls the power, And it was quickly established that to really make this work, you had to have a county-wide commission so that all municipalities had a part and ability to be part of the distribution of water, because then you get into the charges of water. Well, when we started figuring this out, we started putting plans together to draft this countywide commission. It received tremendous opposition from the Treetown Water Commission because they thought they owned the issue They had already made a decision on who were going to be the lawyers, who were going to be the engineers, who was going to operate it, and how they were going to distribute it, and how much they were going to charge, and how they could make a ton of money for municipalities. And we, frankly, several of us thought it was wrong. So we put an amendment on a bill creating the DuPage County Water Commission. Several members would be appointed by the municipalities, and several members would be appointed by the chairman of the county board, and passed the House and Senate and created the DuPage County Water Commission, which was signed by the governor. To this day, some of the individuals that are involved in it are still mad about that legislation because it took it away from the 3 municipalities that had started the process. But look how it's worked. Not only do we distribute water throughout DuPage County, and we have fresh water for the rest of history, but there's been a fair appropriation in terms of the cost and the division of the cost of the system. It cost $400 million to bring the water in from Chicago, piping and so forth.
Who was paying the bills here?
Well, it would be the taxpayers, DuPage County.
Okay, just DuPage County.
And the assessment of against the water itself. It was brought in under budget, on time, and not a single person went to jail. Now, I distinguish that because imagine doing that very same thing in Chicago. Definitely would not have been on budget. Definitely would have been delayed. And the rest is for you to figure out. And I'm pretty proud of that because the chairman of the Water Commission was a fellow by the name of Joe Herter. And he was the first chairman and supervised all of this and had great selection of the executive director and did a wonderful job in bringing that in.
Did that serve to accelerate the growth in the western
I think
suburbs?
I think it added a great deal of quality of life to the suburban areas because there's no question our wells were starting to dry up.
Okay. Well, that gets us to the re-election year, unless you've got anything else for the legislative year. The re-election year in 1984, and it's an off-year election as far as governor's concerned. But now you've got to elect a lot of people in your caucus. This is your first real go-around in that role.
Right.
You remember anything distinctive about that one,
You know,
learning curve on it?
Well, it would have been a tremendous learning curve because, we basically had 20-some campaigns you had to run, and you had to finance them, and you had to raise the money for it. And so we created 2 separate organizations. One was our political organization, and the other was our legislative organization. And the 2 shall never meet. And that's a very important component there. We always made sure we were very, very careful in making sure that the 2 were separated. And some people would leave staff and go on a political staff and were paid for out of the campaigns. Well, in order to have assistance, you have to raise money to pay for that. And that was one of my jobs, to supervise that and to encourage members to help raise the money to pay for these campaigns. And, of course, each individual candidate has his or her own responsibility, too.
At the national level, this is a presidential election year, and you've got Ronald Reagan and Walter Mondale from Minnesota running in the Democratic ticket, and it's a landslide for Ronald Reagan. So was there a coattail effect as far as you remember?
I can't remember what were the numbers that it came up, do you recall?
I don't have the 84 election.
I know we did fairly well. It definitely helped us. The real coattails are by studying the public attitude towards the congressional delegation in the House. So if there's a strong feeling about Republican representatives in Congress, it helps those in the Illinois House. It's an interesting dynamic that we studied very carefully. So as we looked at, if you look at 1995, the Republicans in the House under Newt Gingrich at that time had a very high regard, and there was a very low regard for Democrats. And the landslide that occurred in 1994 or 95 was as a direct result of a high public opinion of Republicans' ability to govern. We benefit from that. We would have benefited from Ronald Reagan, no question about it.
But not to the same extent that you're going to benefit in 1994 when you became the speaker.
Well, we were much more seasoned by then.
Okay. That gets us, well, I guess the next question here, and I don't know when this would have happened, but I did want to take a brief diversion here and ask you about getting remarried here. Was that about that time frame?
No, you mean myself?
Yeah.
I got remarried in 1981.
Okay. Okay.
That's when George Ryan came to me and said that he's going to make me the majority whip. And I said to my wife, "You're a lucky charm."
Okay, let's get to 1985, 1986. And would it be fair to say that the year after an election is always a busy year legislatively?
Yes, that's the most productive time, and the time that people are feeling much more comfortable about tackling tougher issues. The session that we just entered in now, February 2012, as you know, an election is around the corner, and members will be looking at their votes on how it's going to play out in November at election time. So less has a tendency to be done. For the most part, you'll never get a tax increase done in the election year.
Okay.
Why do you think they increased taxes last year?
I believe that one of the major issues in the 1985 legislative year then was the Department of Public Aid and their particular budget. And it was said that year that you were holding their budget hostage.
Me?
And you're gesturing, yeah.
I'm in the minority. How could I do that? I know how I could do it. And we were able to do it once, but they made sure it could never happen again. At that time, when you picked up sponsorship of bills, you had the complete control on what happened with that bill, whether it was called for passage, tabled, or moved for passage. And I sponsored many of the administration's appropriation bills because the governor was Thompson and I was the Republican leader of the House. So Lee Daniels was the sponsor of most of the appropriation issues. Remembering now, of course, the House is Democrat. So Jim Thompson's that year, Build Illinois, was a major program of his. And like I said earlier in our conversation, all governors want to be able to have solid revenue and budgets and be able to cut ribbons on new projects. Jim Thompson was no exception. If I were governor, I'd be the same way. But that's not my job. My job is to do everything I can to protect the budget and to protect my members and to protect the districts we represent. So Governor Thompson, with great fanfare, introduced Build Illinois. And people said, "Well, where are you?" I said, "Well, I'm not sure I like this." Why didn't I like it? Because we found out that he had some understandings, if I might quote unquote, with the Democrat leaders to put about 2/3 of the money into Cook County and the city of Chicago, leaving don't hold me to the exact numbers, about 1/3 of what's remaining left in the rest of the state, which would mean most of my districts would get a very little percentage of that. My position was, the governor was, you want our votes? Divided equally. The Democrats get half, the Republicans get half. What do I mean by that? Their districts, their areas. The collar counties get its fair share based upon population. Downstate gets its fair share. And so does Chicago. You take the percentage of population. Well, that's not for you to decide, was the answer. I said, well, if you want my votes, it's for me to decide. And so back and forth, meetings back and forth on Build Illinois. And where I understood where the governor was coming, it was not consistent with our caucus's drive, because we determined early on that we weren't going to support it if we didn't get a fair share.
It being Build Illinois or Public Aid?
Build Illinois. No. Public Aid had nothing to do with this at that point.
Okay.
Build Illinois. And the projects, the capital project, the road project, the bridge improvements, and things that go along, the improvements to the University of Illinois, the maintenance of state buildings. All these things play into that, which we knew were needed. But we took a very firm position. And again, could they have passed it without us? Sure. They had enough votes to pass it without us. but they didn't want to pass it without us. They needed Republican votes to be on it, and no one from the House on the Republican side would support it unless we had an understanding that the distribution and allocation of the funds. Where does public aid come in? It so happens that I'm the sponsor of the public aid budget. It's now the end of June, and the public aid budget has not been called for passage yet, and that's mainly because we hadn't worked out all the details. One of my members, my floor leader at the time, Sam Vinson, who was the assistant minority leader of the House, came to me and said, I have an idea. And I said, what's that? And he said, don't call the public aid budget. Let us go into overtime. You're the only one that can call it. If we go into overtime, then you just hold that budget until we have our Build Illinois deal. I said, are you sure? And he said, it'll work. Well, it worked, but I took all kinds of unbelievable pressure and hits and every day and hate mail and all that other stuff, because what I did was held the public aid budget. We went into extraordinary majority session, which I've explained before, the 1st of July, midnight. Now it took an extraordinary vote to pass a bill, which means now on all legislation they need Republican votes to pass and become effective immediately, including Build Illinois. They no longer can pass it by themselves. And the public aid budget is unfunded. I get a visit from the governor's office, the director of human services, by the name of Greg Kohler, who is a very, very good friend of mine. Lee, if you don't call the public aid budget, 17,000 people are not going to get any checks next week. I said, I understand. Next day he comes in, Lee, if you don't call the public aid budget, 80,000 people aren't going to get their checks. I understand. Next day he comes in, Lee, and I finally said to him, Greg, you don't seem to understand. The issues are big. That's important. I don't mean to be insensitive, but I've got to tell you that this is tied together with the governor's Build Illinois program, and he intends to move forward to that. We can resolve this whole issue by together. Well, at that point, I had many editorials being written against me that I was insensitive and uncaring and so forth and so forth. And that's when I stopped reading the papers. I banned them from my office and wouldn't talk to reporters. I held the public aid budget until finally the governor came to my office and said, all right, what do you want? We worked out Build Illinois, we worked out all the other things, but and we worked out the public aid, and at the end of the day, everything was passed. Now, what I didn't comment on was towards the end of session, just before midnight, the governor had called through Mike Madigan the substantive part of Build Illinois. There's two parts: substantive, which is the legal language, and appropriations, which appropriates the funds. You have to pass both. You can't pass one without the other because it won't work. You can't have a substantive law that's unfunded. So he calls the substantive bill. We had determined in caucus we were going to vote for it because we weren't against the idea. And it passed. And Thompson had a huge gathering outside the House chambers with the press all around. And congratulations, Mr. Governor. I know you worked hard on this. The Republicans in the House finally agreed with you. Thompson says, yes, this is a wonderful thing. And a man came up and tapped him on the shoulder and said, Governor, they just called the appropriation bill. It just went down. What do you mean? All House Republicans voted against it. Well, as you can imagine, the governor came storming back into chambers right up to my desk and looked at me and says, what have you done? I said, I told you we weren't for your bill until you worked out the allocation. You haven't worked it out. As you can imagine, it was at that point that, fortunately, we can't have weaponry carried on your body. And certainly not in the House, because it caused some real strain with the governor at that point and the other caucus leaders, because we had determined that we weren't going to support it. We supported the concept, but we did not support the allocation, so we didn't support the appropriation, and it didn't pass, and that then led to the overtime session, because it was right at midnight when it was coming up, and that then led to holding the public aid budget until we agreed on the Build Illinois.
Had the rest of the budget been passed by that time?
Yes.
Okay. Was this an example of your caucus being really firm on this, and you were just reflecting their views, or was this somewhere
I had to lead. I had to make recommendations to the caucus, but it took caucus approval. If they didn't approve it, you're only as strong as you have the support in your caucus. It's like any mayor in any municipality in Illinois. A mayor is only as strong as his council support and the people support him. Mayor Daley is technically a weak mayor in terms of legal jargon, but the council gave him great authority, great approval, which made him an extremely strong mayor. And I was no different. My membership, I had to convince them, I had to be proactive, I had to be visionary, and I had to work with them.
But it sounds like at the end of the day, you and the rest of the caucus were of like mind on this one.
Very much so, as we are in most cases.
Okay. Another piece of legislation, I think that year, June 6th, medical malpractice bill passes the House.
Yes, it kind of much weaker than I had hoped for, but yes, the bill did pass.
Something to...
Well, Republicans generally were for it. It was convincing the Democrats to support it. And obviously tort reform was becoming a big issue because of the cost of medical malpractice insurance. It still is an issue.
Okay. In the veto session that year, as I understand, there's quite a bit that looked like it was taken up. McCormick Place?
McCormick Place reform was on the agenda because there was a huge amount of overspending, a huge amount of problems, and we wanted to reform McCormick Place, which we ended up doing, and that became a battle. And I think, if I recall correctly, Governor Ogilvie was assigned to run the restructuring of McCormick Place and to put it back in form, but it was a major piece of legislation that we passed.
Governor Ogilvie?
Yes, if I recall correctly, or maybe it was. No, I
So we're going back a decade or more.
Yeah. No, well, he wasn't governor then.
Oh, okay.
He was appointed then to maintain the supervision of the Reformation.
How about Farm Aid? This is at a time when farmers are really struggling. They'd gotten over-leveraged and a lot of debt problems.
Yes, and of course to the northern legislators, this was not as important as it was to the central Illinois and southern Illinois legislators, primarily central Illinois legislators. And, we would respond to that because it became a huge issue of the times.
Okay. And the cigarette tax. So another increase?
Another increase. You'll find historically more tax increases than anybody cares to admit or talk to, but we had to finance government. And it's an interesting dynamics because where you try to reduce the reliance on cigarettes, you increase the taxes because you want to bring in additional funds, which means you really want people to continue to smoke. And they keep on, cigarettes, I can't imagine. Unfortunately, today I'm not a smoker. I was. But fortunately, I can't imagine the cost of cigarettes. It's like $2 a cigarette. I'd rather have a shot of scotch or something like that.
But it's easier to push through a sin tax than...
Much easier to push through a sin tax. Very few people hold it against you, except for Philip Morris and R.J. Reynolds and others.
How about the alcohol lobby? Is that a tough one to get through?
Very, very tough, because Phil Rock was very close to the alcohol and liquor lobby, and very tough to get increases in the liquor tax.
Okay. Well, Mr. Speaker, you've been talking quite a bit about Governor Thompson. I want to take a little bit more time to have you flesh some of that out a little bit. And let's start with this one.
Can we take a break?
We may, yes.
Yes, sir, I'm ready.
Okay, we took a little bit of a break here, but we left off. I wanted to ask you some questions, Mr. Speaker, about Governor Thompson, your impressions of him as a person, as a politician. So let's start with Governor Thompson as a campaigner.
One of the best. He had a feel for people. He read people quickly, analyzed them, was able to respond to them, and read their needs and concerns. If I were to say to somebody who wants to run for governor, give them advice, I'd say try to pattern yourself after Governor Thompson. He's one of the best.
But wouldn't that, how do I phrase this? in many respects, he appeared to do campaigning over the top.
Well, you mean like sliding down the slide at the state fair?
His dress and his demeanor and
drinking out of a plunger?
yes, those kinds of things.
Beloved President Obama singing a song. You know, his numbers probably increased substantially after he sang that little part of that song. They love to feel that people in power or running things are one of their own. Thompson would walk into a bar and have a shot and a beer.
Now the contrast is the next governor, Governor Jim Edgar.
Very straight, very solemn, very sincere.
Could it have worked for him to try to model his campaign style after Thompson's, though?
No, you have to be true to yourself. You know, and you can't remake a person to be something that they aren't. You know, Richard Nixon, you couldn't make Richard Nixon warm and fuzzy. But the time he was elected president, people wanted a serious, smart, intelligent individual, maybe a little ruthless, maybe they understood that, but they knew that the art of governance is not always something that is congenial in its fashion.
Do you have any stories, any anecdotes about Jim Thompson on the stump?
Yeah, I have a lot. I remember when he wanted to pass his income tax increase. He knew where I lived in Springfield, right by Washington Park, which was a very big park, and a lot of people ran and walked in the park in the morning. I did every morning. I ran every morning before session. 6 o'clock in the morning, there's this bang on my door, and I look out it was a two-story home I lived in, looked out the window of the second floor, and there's Jim Thompson standing in workout clothes, holding a coffee pot. Wake up. And I lifted the window. I said, what are you doing? He says, get down here, wake up. You're going to have a cup of coffee with me, and we're going to settle this thing on this temporary tax increase that you're talking about. And so I went down, got dressed, put on my gym shoes, got dressed. He had coffee. We had a cup of coffee. And he says, we're going to take a walk in the park. Now, walking in the park with the governor, yes. Security, and of course, everybody wants to say hello, right? But in the process, he was working out a way in which we could help resolve the temporary tax. And it would work, except for he needed to have some permanent revenue to go along with it, to carry through. How do we do that? A penny on the sales tax. Now, I knew this all along, that that's one of the things I would say okay to. And so he said, all right, you got this fancy idea. How do we make it work? And I said, well, we put the temporary tax on, and then when the recession is better, we can drop it off in 18 months. He says, it's not going to sustain us. We still need some more revenue. And I knew that. And he turned to me and he says, what do you do? And I said, put a penny on the sales tax. He said, you'd accept that? I said, yeah. He says, well, how do we do that? I said, why don't you go see Pate and have him suggest it? Which he did. So we're in the meeting, and Thompson says, how are we going to resolve this? I said, you know, Governor, you know our position, that's it. And Governor turns to Pate and says, Pate, what do you think we should do? Pate says, well, we've been thinking about this. And I talked to my members, he used to call them guerrillas, and he said, frankly, I think we ought to put a penny on the sales tax. And everybody looked around and says, that might work. End of story.
But the whole thing started in this meeting in Washington Park early in the morning.
The resolution started, not the whole thing. You know, we were towards the end. We needed to find that additional bit of revenue, and we did that by the penny on the sales tax.
I've also heard some stories about Thompson's willingness to actually go into the legislature, go down to the floor, the proverbial put his feet up on somebody's desk and
oh yeah, he was very engaging and very forceful. I mean, tall, smart, good looking, young, and he knew how to handle people. And after all, legislators are just like anyone else, you know, and there's some people in there that are salt of the earth, and there are some people there that frankly I wouldn't want to have any coffee with, but fortunately they're in the extreme minority. But Thompson was very good at that, and you know, I'll never forget the time when the White Sox wanted to move to Florida. Now, for the White Sox, it made tremendous sense, because if you take a compass and you put a spot on then Comiskey Park and run it in a circle 360 degrees, Where is most of your membership? It's in the lake, geographically. If you take that very same compass and put it in Tampa, Florida, most of your membership is, of course, on land and where it was located and available. Plus, Reinsdorf negotiated statewide cable rights. That's why Reinsdorf was basically in favor of going to Florida. But he had promised Jim Thompson, if he built him a new stadium, he'd stay in Illinois. Promise that Reinsdorf ended eating at the end, because Reinsdorf's an honorable man and keeps his word. And the first vote that went up to build a new park in Chicago lost. And the time expired on the clock, and everyone could look at the clock and see it was past midnight. Now it wasn't just a simple majority, it was an extraordinary majority. Well, 2 minutes later, they called the bill again. Thompson comes to the floor. He needs one vote. He comes up to me and he says, "Lee, I need your vote." I said, "You're not going to get it." My law firm represented the White Sox, and I had a huge conflict, and there's no way I'm going to create myself some legal problems by voting for the stadium. And I told
Were you
Thompson,
abstaining from that vote?
Yeah, I did. I abstained from that vote. And I told Thompson, I said, "There's no way I can vote for it." Jerry Reinsdorf's a personal friend of mine besides. Right across from me was a guy named Jim Stang. Jim Stang was voting no. Well, as you recall, Alan Dixon had been elected U.S. Senate. There was an opening in the Secretary of State's office, and Thompson had not appointed that opening yet. So Thompson said to Stang, "Jim, I need your vote. What will it take?" Stang looked up at Thompson and said, "I want to be the next Secretary of State." Thompson said, "Why not?" With that, Stang reached up and voted yes. Changed his vote. Bill passes. The Speaker then says, "This bill, having received a constitutional majority at 11:59 p.m. on such and such a date, is hereby declared passed." Now, important in two things. One, it was after midnight. Court challenge saying that the bill passed, and they pulled the records, and today your debates are time-stamped. And the timestamp showed that it was 3 minutes after midnight, so it took an extraordinary majority. But the court ruled that the Speaker's pronunciation of the time is a controlling factor, and therefore the bill passed. Isn't that great?
And the Speaker at that time was
Mike Madigan.
Madigan.
Yeah. And so...
But the rest of the story is we know that Stang didn't become the...
Well, Stang walks out of the chambers, and the press says, "Why'd you vote for that bill? You changed your vote." "I'm going to be the next Secretary of State," he says. They then run right over to Jim Thompson. "Did you promise that you'd make him the next Secretary of State if he voted for the bill?" "No. He told me he wanted to be the next Secretary of State," and I said, "Why not?" That's all I said. I didn't promise anything. The art of negotiation and specificity.
Well, he obviously didn't gain any great friendship with Jim Stang in the process, I would think.
Stang lost his next election.
So does that mean Thompson was careful in who he was selecting to sway the vote?
Well, that means that Thompson had a pretty good handle on how he could get votes. And where you and I would have said, "Are you kidding? What are you, nuts?" Thompson said, "Why not?" And it was brilliant. But that's Jim Thompson, has one of the finest minds around. And I once said to Thompson, I said, "You're the only guy I know that could jump out of the Hancock Center and land on his feet and walk away." He liked that.
Governor Thompson is clearly the leader of the Republican Party in the state, but he wasn't necessarily the behind-the-scenes leader. Who was the party leader during these years in the 1980s?
I'm trying to recall. I think it was Doc Adams.
Is that the Central Committeeman? Is that the name?
Yeah, the state chairman of the Republican Party. Doc Adams, and I think followed by Al Jordan, if I'm not mistaken. And then Harold Byron Smith.
Doc Adams, what was his...
He was in Springfield.
What was his given name, do you know?
No.
What was the second name he gave you?
Al Jordan.
What was your relationship with them?
It was good. Doc Adams was the chairman when I voted for Bill Redmond for Speaker, and it was a little strained because he was one of the ones to call.
Was that one of the relationships, though, that you had to be careful to cultivate over time?
Well, traditionally, the chairman of the Republican Party has not been that strong.
Not like the Democratic counterpart?
Mike Madigan's strength lies in being Speaker of the House, not necessarily chairman of the party. That's a supplemental.
But he's
power.
wearing both those hats.
He wears both. Wearing both is very, very critical. I mean, it's very powerful, both positions. But if you had to pick one over the other, you'd pick the power of the Speaker.
But the relationship then is the party leader had a bigger role in raising the funds?
No. We always raised our own funds.
What was the role of the party leader then?
Well, to organize the party, to handle things with Washington, to handle the delegate selection for the presidential elections, and party policy. But frequently they would bow to the respective leaders. The governor is the titular head of the party, and to the four leaders head, or respective two leaders of the caucus would have influence.
Does that mean that in your case, you would be the one who would both be raising funds and trying to find good candidates to run in some of these contested districts?
Oh, absolutely. And
much more so than the chairman of the party.
Much more so. And same thing for the Democrats in the House and Senate, and same thing for the Republicans in the House and Senate.
Okay. I wanted to read a quote. I'm jumping around a little bit, but I want to read a quote that Jim Thompson had, and this dates back to 1977. And his view of the art of negotiation, if you will. There will be no tactics of confrontation, no politics of division. Does that sound consistent with the man that you remember?
Well, it sounds consistent with what he would say publicly.
No elaboration from that.
Well, wouldn't we all say that publicly? Doesn't Romney say it now? Obama say it now? We all know there's a difference. You know, the art of governance requires strong views and progressive views. And without that, without either one of those, you don't get anything done. You can't be wishy-washy in presenting a program. When the governor presents Build Illinois, which he believes strongly in, he sets out a program and he starts to sell it. When we're opposed to that, we oppose it and start to sell our reasons. And there's a division that is created there. It's not always comfortable. And sometimes the conversations are something you'd never want to be public because they get fairly brutal. That's the nature of governance.
The other relationship that would have been especially important to you for most of the time you were in the legislature would have been Mike Madigan, the Speaker of the House. How would you characterize that relationship?
Strained at times. Very good to start off with because we were in a huge minority. And so, I wanted to work with him. I knew him, of course. He was assistant to Bill Redmond. And I liked Mike. I've always liked Mike, and I've always respected Mike. There were times that we would have shot each other if we'd had guns, because we were fierce competitors. In a sense, we were fighting for our individual and collective beliefs. And we were representing not only our own beliefs, but our caucus's beliefs and our party's beliefs. And you do your best to stay consistent on that. So I'm one that believes that consistency is very important in governance. You don't have to always toe the line on things like tax increases and things like that, but you have to at least explain what you're doing and why without locking yourself into a position. Because if you lock yourself into a position, then you are really hamstringing your ability to govern. So Mike never or rarely makes the same mistake twice. He learns from his experience. And he's very disciplined, very focused, very knowledgeable on the retention of power, and that's one of his strongest points. And certainly he's been better at it than I was. But of course I didn't start with a score of 36-0.
You're referring back to the cutback amendment and enrolling Chicago.
He starts with a solid 35-36 votes.
Did he have an advantage of being both the party chair for the state and the speaker?
Well, it helps because then he's able to dictate party policy as well. And I say dictate respectfully. I don't mean that to be in a negative sense, because it's impossible to totally dictate. People allow you to govern, and in the end of the day, they give you power. It's very, very difficult to take power. People frequently, willingly give it. It's just study the course of history, and you can see that proven out.
One of the things he's often credited for is that he is a superb vote counter. Would you agree with that?
Yeah.
Knows where his caucus is on any issue.
And so did I. And we never, either one of us, ever misrepresented our votes. When we arranged an understanding and agreement, we always, without fail, had our votes there. Which means that when I went into a meeting with Speaker Madigan and said that we can accept this part of the deal if there's A, B, and C, and he says okay, and then he says how many votes do you have on it, and I tell him I have 36 votes or whatever the number is, 28 votes or whatever, I always delivered the number that we agreed upon, and so did he. Now, that gives you strength, because you walk in with the governor, you cut a deal with the other leaders, they know that you're going to deliver on that deal.
So that's the essential element of trust between the two opposing party leaders?
Yeah, sure. I have to know that he's going to deliver on what he agrees to. And he has to know that I'm going to deliver. And he'll tell you that, by the way, that I always was able to keep my word.
Well, I hope to have a chance to interview him sometime. And we're speaking only
He should have been at the college.
a couple weeks ago. And why don't you tell us what happened a couple weeks ago here? You've been out of the house now for what?
Since 2007.
So 5+ years.
Yeah. And, you'll always miss parts of it because I spent my adult life representing the people of this area and was very grateful to have a wonderful career. And I'm blessed for that, and I'm grateful to the people that sent me to Springfield. But in the course of dealing for 32 years with Mike Madigan, we had a very excellent relationship at times and very strained at other times, but consistently a mutual respect for each other. So I had not gone back to Springfield for 3.5 years on purpose because I wanted to make sure that the new leader was able to solidify his position. And besides that, I'm not in government anymore. So when I finally returned as a representative of Elmhurst College, I scheduled a meeting with Mike, with Speaker Madigan. And during the course of the meeting, I pointed out to him that I sponsored governmental forums at Elmhurst College, and I'd like him to be the speaker. And he said, tell me about it. And I explained it to him that it was in the morning, that there'd be 2 speakers. He'd be the keynote speaker, and he needed to address the group for 45 minutes to an hour, take Q&A for about a half an hour, and then be available for a press conference. He got up, he walked to his desk, picked up his schedule, flipped some pages, says, I can do it. Agreed to it.
Well, it's significant because he's otherwise notoriously tight-lipped about these things.
Totally. But he knew, well, first of all, we have that respect for each other, that he knew that this forum was going to be run properly, respectfully, and that it wasn't any kind of a subterfuge. I mean, he's coming into DuPage County, arguably the heart of Republicanism in the state of Illinois, and very unusual to begin with. Giving an address, very unusual. I can't remember when he last spent that amount of time. And then opening up to a press conference, very unusual, unless he's in session. But he knew that it would be an appropriate forum. He did an excellent job.
And he got a ton of press coverage.
Absolutely. Every word he issued was analyzed and reanalyzed. And I think Doug Finke of the Springfield Journal wrote the most interesting article, which says that Madigan graced us with his presence. And then talked about some of the quotes. I don't know if you read that article.
Yeah.
But as I said earlier, we were in the New York Times, the Washington Post, referred to on the AP stories, and these are just some of the covers there. And he assessed 3 decades of Illinois governors, which I thought was most interesting. And it was an interesting time, good time.
Was that something you personally like to do, is to give public presentations, speeches, press
That's one of the
conferences?
things I do at the college. I am a distinguished fellow, a vote by the faculty, and I teach government. and I'm a consultant to the president in government and community affairs, and I'm in charge of the annual governmental forum.
But this is a question pertaining to your time as minority leader in those 2 years you were speaker. Was that something that the part of the public face of the Republican Party in the state? Or were you more comfortable with being behind the scenes like Madigan has traditionally been?
No, I've never been shy about the press. I've always been pretty forthright in terms of that.
Okay. Well, the next two players I want to talk about are your Senate counterparts. And let's start with your Republican counterpart, James Pate Phillip. Would you agree a different personality?
Well, much different than me. He had a tendency to shoot from the hip. He would frequently express his individual views on things which were not necessarily consistent with my views, which is okay. He was more of a John Wayne person. You could use that analogy.
I know he admires John Wayne deeply, but also mirrored that personality or those characteristics?
Yeah, he did. You know, very, very strong, very forceful, sometimes a bully. Very powerful, chairman of the DuPage County Republican Party, which, as you know, is the strongest Republican county in the state. I supported him on that position as a committeeman. I voted for him when he was first elected, and supported him during the course of his career. We had an on-again, off-again relationship, probably caused by, I think he viewed me more like a son than like a counterpart. And when we would have a disagreement, he would become very irritated because I think he felt that I should pay more attention to his view.
When you would have meetings that involved the four tops, would you and he normally try to get together beforehand going in?
At times we would, but at times we had different views. Remember, I had twice the membership. So I had twice the personalities. I had twice the division. I had twice the diversity. I had twice the campaigns that I had to run. Twice. 5 times the campaigns that I had to run versus his. And so it created some natural division between the House and the Senate. That's not unusual. You see that in Washington today. John Boehner and Mitch McConnell, and you can see, there's a difference there. But, again, senators have a tendency to see themselves a little higher level than House members, if I can say that. Have a tendency to look a little down on the House members. But we have a tendency to want to smack them around a little bit. I say that respectfully.
But isn't it interesting that both at the federal and at the state level, the Speaker of the House is generally to be, the 4 leaders is usually considered to be the most powerful?
It's because of the membership. First of all, the Senate represents the state, whereas the House members are representing districts and the people of those districts. So where John Boehner is the Speaker of a House consisting of 435 members, the diversity is incredible and much more consistent with the public at large.
Okay, that leaves us with Phil Rock.
Yeah.
And maybe start with Phil Rock and Mike Madigan, if you can reflect on that relationship.
Well, Phil, very outgoing, Irish, could toss down a beer and a scotch and handle himself very well, and very outgoing. He would frequently go out with his friends sometimes and sing, and he was a decent singer. Oh, Danny Boy was one of his favorite songs. Just a wonderful man. Oak Park. And hard not to respect him in every part. He's a good person, and I liked him a lot. And I, for the most part, was a fair person. Now, when we got down to hardcore issues like redistricting and things like that, I always thought he was unfair. But that's a different story. And very, very highly regarded by people in general, and as is today. And I regarded him very highly, as I do today.
The relationship between Madigan and Rock?
Sometimes strained, natural relationship, Speaker, President, just like Pate and myself. Easier to govern the Senate because you have less members, and the issues are not as difficult. The campaigns are not as difficult. And so there were times that the relationship was strained, but, we all understand the basic rules, and that is Pete and I could fight like cats and dogs, but at the end of the day, we knew we had to come together, and we did.
The fights between Madigan and Rock would be more subtle in nature?
I think so. I think, Pate would say some incredibly terrible things at times.
So that has a lot more to do with Philip's personality than anything else.
Let's just say that somebody can write a book on Philip's comments over the years, and may do it someday. Not me. But
Well,
somebody.
plenty of them have made the press in the first place.
You've read them.
Okay. There's one other person I wanted to ask you about, her title, and because it's always been a source of political power in the state of Illinois, and that's the mayor of Chicago. Now, obviously, the time frame we're talking about is beyond the time when Richard J. Daley was sitting in that office. But that's not to say that the mayor of Chicago was somebody who could be ignored. So let's start with the first one you probably dealt with quite a bit, Jane Byrne, 79 to 83.
Well, I didn't deal with her very much. She dealt more with then Mayor Byrne dealt with Bill Redmond mainly, and she was a difficult personality to work with as mayor of Chicago. She was not an establishment person, and she frequently would be at odds with Speaker Madigan, and it's not something that necessarily talk. But I remember when Bill Redmond was speaker and Jane Byrne wanted a bill passed, and the bill didn't pass, and the session was adjourned. Jane Byrne said of Mike Madigan, well, his hands are hot from sitting on him. I got a call from Bill Redmond who said, would you do me a favor? And I said, sure. He said, would you tell the press what you saw in Mike Madigan on this bill? And I said, sure. And I said, I've read the article and listened to the comments by Mayor Byrne that Mike Madigan's hands were hot from sitting on him, not doing anything. I said, anything could be further from the truth. As I was on the floor, I saw him fighting for his cause. We just happened to have a better position on it. And it didn't lose for any lack of effort on his part, I can tell you that.
Next one would be Harold Washington, 1983 to 1987, and obviously it ended tragically with his sudden death.
I had a great relationship with Harold. When I was a freshman legislator and voted for Bill Redmond made Harold Washington the chairman of the Judiciary Committee. I was on the Judiciary Committee. Because Harold Washington supported Bill Redmond, Harold Washington liked me because I helped support Bill Redmond. So I always was treated very nice in committee and afterwards. Lo and behold, Bernie Upton, Harold Washington, Mayor of Chicago, and of course Bernie Upton was one of the former leaders of the House, now running for Mayor of Chicago, strongly supported by George Ryan. Upton loses. Harold Washington becomes the Mayor of Chicago. I call him up and say, can we meet and talk about issues? Sure, come on in. It's like an old friend coming into City Hall. And the thing I remember most is him saying to me, Lee, don't take my airport. Because, we always fought O'Hare Field because it encroached here in DuPage County. Few people know that a third of the airport is in DuPage County, and that was property condemned by the city of Chicago within our county to put the airport in. And of recent vintage, they destroyed half of or more of Bensonville for new runways. So it's been a source of problems since I represented that area.
And otherwise, O'Hare is a great cash cow for Chicago?
Oh, absolutely. And of course, the state would love to have the revenue. Also, patronage. There's huge patronage out at O'Hare Field. Of course, there is no such thing as patronage, I know. But,
not in Illinois, certainly.
So I called up the mayor in April of the year he died and had lunch with him shortly before he died. And we talked on several issues. I liked Harold Washington.
Eugene Sawyer had a short tour,
not real
87
effective.
to 89.
He was a caretaker.
So let's get to Richard M. Daley.
Yes. I had an interesting relationship with, if that's what you're asking.
Yes.
With Richard Daley. My daughter, Lori, my eldest daughter, suffered brain damage shortly after birth and is confined to a wheelchair and is multiply physically and mentally disadvantaged. Lori was in the hospital, Children's Memorial Hospital, undergoing major surgery for hip reduction and some other surgical procedures. At the same time that the Daley's son, Kevin, was in the hospital and ultimately died, as you know, their young son. And at that time, we kind of got to know each other, and he was then a state's attorney. I handled some of his legislation in Springfield when he was state's attorney. When he became mayor, we had a decent relationship until we got to O'Hare Field. And then it wasn't just, Lee, don't take my airport. It was more like, Lee, you take my airport and I'm going to cut your legs off. Not literally, he didn't say that, but that's the impression you got. And we started having a falling out at that point. And then I fought him and the Chicago Democrats consistently on the airport. And at which point we almost had a piece of legislation that passed, which would have given control of the airport to an authority, including O'Hare Field, Midway, and Meigs. And it would have been a statewide authority, an authority in northern Illinois, similar to the RTA, appointed by the governor and the mayor. And it would have been a huge, huge positive bill.
Was a third major airport for Chicago area also part of that mix?
Yes, that would have been Lake Calumet. Yes. And that failed by just a short margin. In fact, Pate Phillip came out against it, which I thought was short-sighted on his part. Edgar and I were both in favor of it.
Well, a lot has happened airport-wise. There never was that third airport, and then Meigs disappeared. But that's
yeah. And it's unfortunate because if you do Peatone now and tie it in by high-speed rail, you could have a really effective multi-airport community, which would really serve the people. You could put a lot of the cargo equipment out at Peatone, if that was a way of doing it. Build up your intermodal system and really have a very, very 21st century movement of products and goods and people.
Okay, that's quite a bit down the road. I wanted to go back now to, I ask you this here, Mr. Speaker, 1986. I'd like to finish off today with a discussion about 1986, and it's as much about the governor's race as anything, but it's up to you if you want to postpone it until tomorrow morning.
Let's finish it.
Okay. The spring session, again, it's an election year, so it probably wasn't nearly as busy as 1985, which there was a lot covered in that particular year. But you still, I think, have a lot more discussion about Build Illinois in 86? Or is that pretty much resolved in your mind?
In my mind, it was pretty much resolved. We had discussions on implementation and the actual programs and products and how we would, I think, if I recall correctly, my memory serves me right, Jim Thompson appointed his then Lieutenant Governor, George Ryan, to handle the review of the projects that would come in as a result of Build Illinois. For instance, every legislator had a wish list. Which ones were the best ones for the state to accomplish the goals that you want to accomplish? And I think George Ryan was in charge of recommending to Jim Thompson that procedure.
Do you recall when the Thompson Center would have been part of the mix when that was discussed?
I don't, but I would assume it's around that time.
Okay. Any memories about...
Yeah, you mean the spaceship that accidentally landed in the city that makes ice cubes, air conditioning, and never heated or cooled properly? You mean that one? You mean the one when we first looked at, we said somebody's going to try to jump at the target down in the middle, and of course they have? That one? So, you mean the one that you walk around with your back to the wall, afraid you're going to fall over the side? Or when you walk down the steps that have no back to them, it scares the daylights out of you? That one?
So, but that is the building that architecturally is most connected with
Helmut
Jim
Jahn.
Thompson. Pardon me?
Helmut Jahn designed it. Oh yeah, the Thompson building. One of the jokes going around is the reason it's named for the Thompson building, or better yet, you know why it's named the Thompson building?
Mm-mm.
No one else would take the name.
So there's a whole set of jokes that go along with the building.
You gotta, yes. And would I have built a different building? Absolutely. Would 90% of the public? Absolutely. But that was Jim Thompson.
That was his concept, his blessing on that one?
But it also represented his type of thinking. Visionary, progressive, and really quite exciting.
Can you recall any other legislative initiatives, major ones that were taken up that year?
Not offhand. Do you have a remembrance of any of that?
I don't have anything else.
I'm sure there was a whole ton, because one thing about Illinois, it doesn't lack from action. And
We've always got the annual budget battles.
that's always a battle, and it's something that people take very seriously. Obviously, your priorities are health care, education, criminal justice, these things, but appropriation-wise, education, health care, and human services always take precedent.
Okay. 1986 was another one of those political years in Illinois where things became a little bizarre, shall we say. It started off with the gubernatorial primary on the Democratic side, and I think the Democrat Party was very surprised when Adlai Stevenson III was the clear winner in the gubernatorial ticket in the primary, but they were surprised by two LaRouche candidates. I think it was Secretary of State and Lieutenant Governor. And these two LaRouche candidates suddenly emerged as the Democratic winners of their primaries.
Right.
And I'll let you pick it up from there and your memories about all of that.
Well, I don't remember the exact name. I mean, those are things you try to put in the back of your mind.
Mark Fairchild was the Lieutenant Governor winner, and Janice Hart won for Secretary of State. So Fairchild, Hart, those are good all-American names.
Yeah, and of course, if I'm running for Secretary of State, I think I've just been handed a wonderful present. And I think our candidate was Jim Edgar. And
Jim Edgar.
Jim Edgar had to look at it. Now, Jim Edgar had not always been successful in his political career. He lost his first race for state representative. But he was clearly our favorite for Secretary of State. And what greater president that you can have than a candidate the Democrat Party is not going to support? And they didn't view Jim Edgar as a particular threat, so, that was a great thing for Jim Edgar. And was it Dave O'Neill? Who was our lieutenant governor? Oh, George Ryan.
George Ryan, yeah.
And so, obviously they ran it as a team, that part. Can you imagine running with a team with somebody you don't like? So, anyhow, having said that, that was a great opportunity for us in '86. But Adlai Stevenson, at that point, was that the 5,275 votes?
The '82 election was very close.
That was the one. 5,000 with Stevenson and Thompson.
Yeah, and
that's
it
when
went down to the courts.
Yeah, and the Supreme Court. And in fact, Justice Simon actually wrote the opinion of the Supreme Court. '86, he won fairly handily. I mean, the party, the Democrat Party, was somewhat dysfunctional at that time.
Well, Stevenson ended up, as I know you'll recall, saying, I can't possibly run as a Democrat now, so he changed his party affiliation temporarily to the Solidarity Party. I don't know if that was modeled after what was going on in Poland at the time. And here was his quote, and I'll read this to you, get your reaction. I am exploring every legal remedy to purge these extremists from the Democratic ticket. But one thing I want to make absolutely clear, I will never serve on a ticket with candidates who espouse the hate-filled folly of Lyndon LaRouche and the U.S. Labor Party.
Well, and he meant it, and he kept his word, and he didn't.
How was Stevenson as a candidate on this
stuff? Oh, he
stuff?
was very dry. He was very boring. Against Jim Thompson, Mr. Outgoing, Mr. Brilliance, Mr. Personality. I mean, Thompson loved campaigning. He likes people. You could tell that he has an annual Christmas party at the Drake, and we still pay homage to him and still go in and kiss his ring. And I admire him greatly.
But there are a lot of people, as I understand, going into that '86 election, thought that Thompson was vulnerable. He'd been governor for a long time already.
Well, I think that would be a fair assessment prior to the primary. When the LaRouches came out and Stevenson makes a comment like that, what do you think people say? We're going to help you keep your word. So you don't have to serve with these guys. We just won't elect you. We saw it as our duty.
Okay. The general election then, Thompson gets 52.7% of the vote. Stevenson gets 40%. Fairchild gets 6.6%. And I'm surprised even by getting that much.
That much, right.
So,
and Jim Edgar's on his way.
yeah, Jim Edgar wins handily as well.
Right.
Did Thompson, you think, feel like he had a mandate coming out of that election?
No, I don't know. That wasn't a huge election result. But as you pointed out, it's somewhat a result of 82 being so close. So, Thompson at that point, people knew him as a spender, and there was an element of the Republican Party that didn't like all spending. They wanted to cut the spending, which is not foreign to our party. So,
how did you fare coming out of that election? Not just you personally, but the caucus.
I think we did okay. I don't remember. You have the number breakdown?
No, I don't. I should have, but I don't.
And I should have it too. But if I recall correctly, our numbers were getting closer and better. I mean, certainly better than we started out in 83 rather.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, I think that's probably a pretty good place to finish for today, if you don't mind, and we'll pick this up tomorrow morning.
Okay, that's fine. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.